DH Audio presents The Ghost Rides Tonight by Max Brand. Read by Ben Murphy.
The Ghost Rides Tonight. The gold strike, which led the fortune hunters to Murrayville, brought with them the usual proportion of bad men and outlaws. 3 months after the rush started, a bandit appeared so consummate in skill and so cool in daring that all other offenders against the law disappeared in the shade of his reputation. He was a public dread. His comings were unannounced, his goings left no track. Men lowered their voices when they spoke of him. His knowledge of affairs in the town was so uncanny that people called him the Ghost. The stages which bore gold to the railroad 130 miles to the south left at the most secret hours of night, but the Ghost knew. Once he stuck up the stage not a mile from town while the guards were still occupied with their flasks of snakebite. And again when the stage rolled on at midday, 80 miles south of Murrayville, and the guards nodded in the white-hot sun, the Ghost rose from behind a bush, shot the near leader, and had the cargo at his mercy in 30 seconds. He performed these feats with admirable finesse. Not a single death laid charge to his account, for he depended upon surprise rather than slaughter. Yet so heavy was the toll he exacted that the miners passed from fury to desperation. They organized a vigilance committee. They put a price on his head. Posses scoured the region of his hiding place, Hunter's Canyon, into which he disappeared when hard-pressed, leaving no more trace than the morning mist which the sun disperses. While 200 men rode almost within calling distance, the Ghost appeared in the moonlight before Pat McDonald and Peters and robbed them of 18 pounds of gold dust which they carried in their belts. When the vigilante committee got word of this insolent outrage, they called a mass meeting. Never in the history of Murrayville had there been so grave and dry-throated an affair. William Collins, the head of the vigilantes, addressed the assembly. He listed the Ghost's outrages and pointed out that what the community needed was an experienced manhunter to direct their efforts, and ended by asking Silver Pete to stand up before them. After some urging, Pete arose and stood beside Collins with his hat pushed back from his gray and tousled forelock, and both hands tugging at his cartridge belt. "Men," went on Collins, placing one hand on the shoulder of the man-killer, "we need a leader who is a born and trained fighter, a man who will attack the Ghost and never stop after he takes up the trail. And I say the man we need is Silver Pete." The audience stirred, caught each other with side glances, and then stared back at Silver Pete. His reputation gave even Murrayville pause, for his reputed killings read like the casualty list of a battle. "I repeat," said Collins after a pause, in which he allowed his first statement to shudder its way home, "that Silver Pete is a man for us. I've talked it over with him before this, and he'll take the job, but he needs an inducement. And I propose that we give him any loot which may be on the Ghost's person. If the Ghost is disposed of in a place where he's cached his plunder, the finder gets it all. It's a high price to pay, but this thing has got to be stopped. My own opinion is that the Ghost is a man who does his robbing on the side and lives right here among us. And if that's the case, we'll leave it to Silver Pete to find him out. And we'll obey Pete's orders. He's the man for us. He has a straight eye and he's fast with his 6-gun. And if you want to know Pete's reputation as a fighting man, he'll tell you himself," said a voice, and a laugh followed. Silver Pete scowled in the direction of the laugh, and his right hand caressed the butt of his gun. But 2 miners rose from the crowd, holding a slender fellow between them. "It's only Geraldine," said one of them. "There ain't no call to flash your gun, Pete." "Well, take the drunken fool away," ordered Collins angrily. "Who let him in here?" "Mr. Collins," said Geraldine, doffing his broad-rimmed hat and speaking with a thick telltale accent. "Mr. Collins, I ask your pardon, sure." He bowed unsteadily, and his hat brushed the floor. "I plumb forgot I was in church with Silver Pete for a preacher," he went on. "Take him out of here, will ya?" thundered Collins. The 2 men at Geraldine's side turned him about and led him towards a door. and here he struggled away from his guides. "Mr. Collins, if I capture the ghost, do I get the loot?" A yell of laughter drowned the reply, and Geraldine staggered from the room. "What do you say, man?" roared Collins, enraged by these repeated interruptions. "Is Silver Pete the man for us?" There was a deep muttering of consent. "All right." Collins turned to Pete. "You're in charge here, and it's up to you to tell us what to do. You're the foreman, and we're all your gang." "Give us a speech, Pete!" yelled a miner. Silver Pete favored the speaker with a venomous scowl. "Speech? Nothing. I ain't here to talk. I ain't no gossiping bit of calico. I got a hunch my 6-gun will do my chattering for me." "But what do you want us to do, Pete? How are we going to help you?" asked Collins. "Sit tight and chaw your tobacco. I don't want no advice. There's been too many posses around these diggings. Maybe I'll start and hunt the ghost myself. Maybe I won't. If I want help, I'll come asking it." As a sign that the meeting had terminated, he pulled his hat further down over his eyes, hitched his belt, and stalked through the crowd without looking to either side. Thereafter, Murrayville saw nothing of him for a month, during which the ghost appeared 5 times and escaped unscathed. The community pondered and sent out to find Pete, but the search was in vain. There were those who held that he must have been shot down in his tracks by the ghost, but the majority felt that, having undertaken his quest alone, Pete was ashamed to appear in town without his victim. On the subject of the quest, Geraldine composed a ballad, which he sang to much applause in the saloons of town. It purported to be the narrative of Silver Pete's wanderings in search of the ghost. In singing it, Geraldine borrowed a revolver and belt from one of the bystanders, pushed back his hat, and imitated the scowling face of Pete so exactly that his audience applauded wildly. The ballad concluded with a wailing stanza. "I don't expect no bloomin' tears. The only thing I ask is something for a monument in the way of a whiskey flask." Geraldine sang himself into popularity and many drinks with his song, and for the first time the miners began to take him almost seriously. He had appeared in town shortly after old John Murray struck gold 6 months before. He was a slender man of 35 with a sadly drooping mouth and humorous eyes. He introduced himself as Gerald Leroy Witherstone and was immediately christened Geraldine. Thereafter, he wandered about the town with no apparent occupation, except to sing for his drinks in the saloons. Hitherto he'd been accepted as harmless and amusing, but his ballad gave him a Homeric repute, particularly when the men remembered that the song was bound to come sooner or later to the ears of Silver Pete. For the time being, Pete was well out of earshot. After the meeting, he spent most of the evening equipping himself for the chase. Strangely enough, he did not hang a second revolver to his belt, nor strap a rifle behind his saddle. Neither did he mount a fleet horse. To pursue the elusive ghost, he bought a dull-eyed mule with a pendulous lower lip. On the mule he strapped a heavy pack, which consisted chiefly of edibles, and in the middle of the night he led the mule out of Murrayville in such a way as to evade observation. Once clear of the town, he headed straight for Hunter's Canyon. Once inside the canyon, he began his search. While he worked, he might have been taken for a prospector, for there was not a big rock in the whole course of the canyon which he did not examine from all sides. He climbed up and down the cliffs on either side, as if he expected the ghost might take wings and fly up the sheer rock to the cave. The first day he progressed barely half a mile. The second day he covered even less ground. His search went on with a vision of the outlaw's lot before him. Soon his food supply was exhausted. Even his coffee gave out. For 10 days he lived on flour, salt, and water. And then, as if this saintly fast were necessary before the vision, Pete saw the ghost. It was after sunset, but the moon was clear when he saw the phantom rider race across the far side of the valley. The turf deafened to the sound of the horse's hooves, and like an apparition, the ghost galloped close to the wall of the valley and disappeared. Pete rubbed his eyes and looked again. The horse with its rider had vanished into thin air between him and the sheer rock of the valley wall. A little shudder passed through his body, but the dream of plunder restored his courage. He carefully observed the marks which should guide him to the point on the rock at which the rider disappeared. He hobbled a mule, examined his revolver, spun the cylinder, and then started down across the canyon. He had camped upon high ground, and his course led him on a sharp descent to the stream which cut the heart of the valley. Here, for 200 yards, trees and the declivity of the ground cut off his view. But when he came to the higher ground again, he found that he had wandered only a few paces to the left of his original course. The wall of the valley was now barely 50 yards away, and as nearly as he could reckon the landmarks, the point at which the rider vanished was at or near a shrub which grew close against the rock. For an instant, Pete thought that the tree might be a screen placed before the entrance of a cave. Yet the rider made no pause to set aside the screen. He walked up to it and peered beneath the branches. He even fumbled at the base of the trunk to make sure that the roots actually entered the earth. And after this faint hope disappeared, Pete stepped back and sighed. His reason vowed that it was at this point that the horse turned to air, and Pete's was not a nature which admitted the supernatural. He turned to the left and walked along the face of the cliff for 50 paces. It was solid rock. A chill, like a moving piece of ice, went up Pete's back. He returned to the shrub and passed around it to the right. At first he thought it was merely the black shadow of the shrub. He stepped closer and then crouched with his revolver raised, for before him opened a crevice directly behind the shrub. It was a trifle over 6 feet high and less than half that in width. A man could walk through that aperture and lead a horse. Pete entered the passage with cautious steps. Between each step he paused and listened. His progress was so painfully slow that he could not even estimate distances in the pitch dark. The passage grew higher and wider. It turned sharply to the right. A faint light shone. Pete crouched lower, and the grin of expectancy twisted at his lips. He scarcely dared to breathe, for fear of the bullet which might find him out. Before him was the light which must outline, however faintly, the figure of anyone who lurked in wait. With these things in mind, he went more rapidly. The passage widened again. He peered cautiously around the edge of a rock and looked into as comfortable a living room as he had ever seen. The rock hung raggedly from the top of the cave, but the sides were smooth from the action of running water through many long years. The floor was level-packed gravel. Silver Pete remained crouched at the sharp angle of the passage until he heard the stamp and snort of a horse. It gave him heart and courage to continue inch by inch, foot by foot, pace by pace, toward the light. A tall, sinewy horse was tethered at one end, and at the opposite side sat a man with his back to Pete, who leveled his revolver and drew a bead on a spot between the shoulder blades. And yet he did not fire, for the thought came to him that if it were an honor to track the ghost to his abode and kill him, it would be an immortal glory to bring the bandit back alive. Once more, that cat-like progress began, until he could see that the ghost sat on his saddle in front of a level-topped boulder. The air was filled with the sweet savor of fried bacon and coffee. Pete had crawled to the very edge of the cave, where the horse threw up his head and snorted loudly. The ghost straightened and tilted back his head to listen. "Up with your hands!" snarled Silver Pete. The ghost did not even turn. His hands raised slowly above his shoulders to the level of his head and remained there. "Stand up," said Pete, and rose from the ground against which he had flattened himself. For if the ghost had decided to try a quick play with his gun, the shot in 9 cases out of 10 would travel breast high. "Turn around," ordered Pete, feeling more and more sure of himself as he studied the slight proportions of the outlaw. The ghost turned and showed a face with a sad mouth and humorous eyes. "By God!" cried Silver Pete. and took a pace back, which brought his shoulders against the wall of the rock. Geraldine. If the ghost had had his gun on his hip, he could have shot Pete 10 times during that moment of astonishment. But his belt and revolver hung on a jutting rock 5 paces away. He dropped his hands to his hip and smiled at his visitor. When they put you on the job, Pete, I had a hunch I should beat it. Damn me, Geraldine. I can't believe my eyes. Well, it's me, all right. You got me dead to rights, Pete. So what do you think the boys will do with me? And you're the ghost? Silver Pete pushed back his hat as though to give his thoughts freer play. What'll they do with you? I don't know. You ain't plugged nobody, Geraldine. I reckon they'll just ship you south and let the sheriff handle you. Get away from that gun! For Geraldine had stepped back with apparent unconcern until he stood within a yard of his revolver. Gun? Say, Pete, do you think I'll try any gunplay while you have the drop on me? He laughed. Nope. If you was one of them tin horn gunmen from the town over yonder, I'd lay 10 to 1 I could drill you and make a getaway, but you ain't one of them, Pete. And seeing it's you, I ain't gonna try no funny stuff. I don't hanker after no early grave, Pete. This tribute sent a placid glow of satisfaction in Pete's eyes. Well, take it from me, Geraldine. You're wise. But there ain't no need for you to get scared of me. So long as you play the game square and you don't try no fancy moves. Now, show me where you got the loot stowed and show it quick. As if you don't. The threat was unfinished, but Geraldine nodded. Sure, I'll show you, Pete. I know when I've got a hand that's worth playing. And I ain't a gent to bet a measly pair of trays against a full house. Take a slant over there behind the rocks and you'll find it. He indicated a pile of stones of all sizes which lay heaped in a corner. Pete backed toward it with his eyes still upon the ghost. A few kicks scattered the rocks and exposed several small bags. When he stirred these with his foot, their weight was eloquent, and the gunfighter's smile broadened. Think of them 10 horns that offered all your pickings to the man that got you dead or alive, Geraldine. The ghost sighed. Easy pickings. No more strong-arm work for you, Pete. The jaw of Silver Pete set sternly again. Lead your horse over here and help me stow this stuff in the saddlebags, and if you make a move to get the horse between me and you... The ghost grinned in assent and saddled his mount and led it to Pete. Now get your hands up over your head again, Geraldine, and go out and down the tunnel about 3 paces ahead of me. Geraldine stopped at the boulder to finish off his coffee. He turned to Pete with the cup poised at his lips. Say, Pete, anything wrong with a cup of coffee and a slice of bacon before we start back? My gosh, Geraldine, you're a cool bird, but your game is too old. Nevertheless, his very soul yearned towards the savor of bacon and coffee. The ghost caught the gleam of Pete's eye. Game? What game? I say let's start up a coffee pot in a frying pan. I can turn out flapjacks browner than the ones your mother used to make, Pete. Pete drew a great breath, for the taste of his flour and water diet of the past few days was sour in his mouth. Geraldine, it's a go. But if you try any funny passes, I ain't gonna wait for no explanations. Now slide out the chow. He rolled a large stone close to the boulder which served as a dining table to the bandit, and sat down to watch the preparations. The ghost paid little attention to him, but hummed as he worked. Soon a fire snapped and crackled. While the bacon fried, he mixed pancake flour in a tin plate. The ghost piled the crisp slices of bacon on a second tin plate, and used the fried-out fat to cook the flapjacks. What I can't make out is why you do this job for those yellow livers over in the town. Why, you poor nut. I ain't working for them. I'm working for the stuff that's up there behind the saddle. The ghost stared at him. Well, say, do you think that they'll really let you walk off with all that loot? The face of the gunman darkened. I know they'll let me. That was the way they talked. Geraldine turned back to his work without further comment. In a few moments he finished. He put the food on the boulder before Silver Pete, and then sat on the other side of the big stone. The gunfighter laid his revolver beside his tin cup and attacked the food with a will of 10. Yet even while he ate, he noted that the ghost stared at him with a curious and almost pitying interest. "Look here. Just what were you aiming at a while ago?" Geraldine shrugged his shoulders and let his eye wander away as though the subject embarrassed him. "Damn it! Don't go staring at me like that! What's biting you?" "It ain't my business. As long as I'm done for, I don't care what they do to you." "What do you mean? You mean to say them quitters are gonna double-cross me?" The ghost answered nothing, but the shrug of his shoulders was eloquent. "Geraldine, you ain't playing fair with me. Look what I done for you. Any other man would have plugged you the minute they seen you, but here I am, letting you walk back safe and sound, treating you as if you was my own brother almost." Geraldine met his stare with a steady eye. "Pete, I'm gonna tell you." Pete settled back in the stone with his fingers playing nervously about the handle of his gun. "They get short, Geraldine. Tell me what them wall-eyed cayuses figured on doing." The ghost studied him. "Look here, Pete. There ain't no getting out of it that some of the things you've done read considerable different from Bible stories." "Well?" "Well, those two-card Johnnies over to town know something of what you've done, and they figure to double-cross you." "Anybody could say that. What's your proof?" "Proof?" echoed the ghost angrily. "Do you think I'm telling you this for fun? No, Pete, it's because I don't want to see those guys do you dirt. You're a real man, and they're only imitation leather. They're tough only in their talk." "Damn 'em." "Well, they knew that once you left town on this job, you wouldn't come back until you had the ghost. Then they got together, and they figured this way. Right after you got back with the ghost, dead or alive, they'd have the sheriff pay you a little visit and stick you in the coop. They've raked up plenty of charges against you, Pete." "What?" "One thing is this. They say that once you went prospecting with a guy called Red Hory. Horace was his right name." Silver Pete shifted his eyes, and his lips fixed in a sculptured grin. "One day you come back from Truckee and say that Red Hory got caught up in a landslide and was killed, and you took the mine. And they say that 2 years later they found a skeleton, and through the skull, right between the eyes, was a little round hole. A powerful-like hole, made by a .45. They lie." "Huh? Well, of course they lie. Nobody could look at you and think that you'd plug a pal. I mean, not for nothing." Pete dropped back to his stone. "Go on, what else do they say?" "Well, I don't remember it all." The ghost puckered his brows with the effort of recollection. "But they got it all planned out. When you come back with the loot, they'll take it and they'll split it between them. 1/3 to Collins, because he made the plan up first. They even made up a song about you. And the song makes a joke out of you, all the way through. It winds up like this. "I don't expect no bloomin' tears, and the only thing I ask is something for a monument in the way of a whiskey flask." "Who made up the song, Geraldine?" "I don't know. Well, I reckon Collins had a hand in it." "Collins? Yeah, it sounds like him. I'll get him first." "It was Collins who got them to send out 3 men to watch you. They was to trail you and see that you didn't make off with the loot. Ever see anybody trailing you, Pete?" "I never thought of it. I didn't know they were such skunks. But I swear they won't ever see the money. I'll take it and I'll line out for new hunting grounds." "But what do you do if they're following you? I mean, what'll you do if they've tracked you here and the sheriff with him? What if they get you for Red Hory?" The horse had wandered a few paces away, and now its hoof struck a loose pebble. which turned with a crunching sound like a football. "Watch out!" The ghost sprung up and pointing towards the entrance. "They've got you, Pete!" The gunfighter whirled to his feet, his weapon poised and his back to the ghost. Geraldine drew back his arm and lunged forward across the boulder. His fist thudded behind Silver Pete's ear. The revolver exploded and the bullet clicked against a rock. Pete collapsed on his face with his arms spread out crosswise. The ghost tied his wrists behind his back with a small piece of rope. Silver Pete lay trussed and unconscious. The ghost turned him on one side and then, strangely enough, set about cleaning up the tinware from the boulder. This he piled back in its niche. A string of oaths announced the awakening of Silver Pete. Geraldine went to him and leaned over his body. Pete writhed and cursed, but Geraldine knelt down and brushed the sand out of the gunfighter's hair and face. Then he wiped the blood from the small cut on Pete's chin where his face struck a rock when he fell. "I have to leave you now, Pete." The ghost rose from this work of mercy. "You've been good company, Pete, but a little of you goes a long way. For sweet sake, don't leave me here to die by inches. I done some black things, Geraldine, but never nothing as black as this. Take my own gun and pull a bead on me. We'll call everything even." The ghost smiled at him. "Think it over, Pete. I reckon you got enough to keep your mind busy. So long." He led his horse slowly down the passage, and the shouts and pleadings of Silver Pete died out behind him. At the mouth of the passage, his greatest shout rang no louder than the hum of a bee. Grimly silent was the conclave in Billy Hillier's saloon. That evening the ghost had stopped the stage scarcely a mile from Murrayville, shot the sawed-off shotgun out of the very hands of the only guard who dared to raise a weapon, and had taken a valuable packet of dust. They sent out a posse at once, which rode straight for Hunter's Canyon, and arrived there just in time to see the phantom horseman disappear. They had matched speed with that rider before, and they gave up the vain pursuit. It was small wonder, therefore, if not a man smiled when a singing voice reached them from the horseman who cantered down the street. "I don't expect no bloomin' tears, and the only thing I ask is something for a monument in the way of a whiskey flask." The sound of the gallop died out before the saloon. The door opened and Geraldine staggered into the room, carrying a small but apparently ponderous burden in his arms. He lifted it to the bar, which creaked under the weight. "Step up and liquor! I got the ghost!" A growl answered him. It was a topic over which they were not prepared to laugh. "Get out and tell that to your horse, son. We got other things to think about than your damn foolery." "Damn foolery? Step up and look at the loot. Dust, boys. Real dust." He untied the mouth of a small buckskin bag and shoved it under the nose of the man who had spoken to him. The latter jumped back with a yell and regarded Geraldine with fascinated eyes. "My gosh, boys, it is dust." Geraldine fought off the crowd with both hands. "All mine. Mine, boys. You voted the loot to the man who caught the ghost." "And where is this ghost?" asked several men together. Collins pushed through the crowd. "Geraldine, if this is another joke, we'll hang you for it." Geraldine said, "I'll give him to you on one ground." "All right, out with it." "I don't want him strung up. Is it a bargain?" "It's a bargain." "We'll turn him over to the sheriff. Are you with me, boys?" They yelled their agreement, and in 30 seconds, every man who had a horse was galloping after Collins and Geraldine. At the shrub beside the wall of the valley, Geraldine drew rein, and they followed him in an awed and breathless body into the passage. "I went out scouting on my own hook, and I saw the ghost ride down the canyon and disappear in here. I followed him." "And what did you do with him?" "You'll see in a minute." There was only one shot fired, and it came from his gun. They turned the sharp angle and entered the lighted end of the passage. In another moment, they crowded into the cave and stood staring at the tightly bound figure of Silver Pete. "Untie his feet, boys," said Collins. "We'll take him back. Silver Pete, you can thank your lucky stars that Geraldine made us a promise to turn you over to the law." Collins turned to Geraldine. "How'd you do it?" "I'm not very handy with a gun, so I tackled him with my fists. Look at that cut in his jaw. That's where I hit him." A little murmur of wonder passed through the group. One of them cut the rope which bound Pete's ankles together, and two more dragged him quickly to his feet. "Stand up like a man, Pete. Thank Geraldine for not cutting out your rotten heart." But Silver Pete, never moving his eyes from the face of the ghost, broke into a long and full-throated laugh and never said a word. "Watch him, boys. He's going loony. Here, Jim, grab on that side and I'll take him here. Now start down that tunnel." Yet as they went forward, the rumbling laugh of the gunfighter broke out again and again. "I've got to leave you here," said the ghost when they came out from the mouth of the passage. "My way runs east, and I've got a date at Tuxie for tonight. I'll just trouble you for that there slicker with the ghost rider's dust in it, Collins." Without a word, the vigilance man unstrapped the heavy packet, which he had tied behind his saddle. He fastened it behind Geraldine's saddle, and then caught him by the hand. "Geraldine, you're a queer cuss. We hadn't made you out yet, but we're going to take a long look at you when you come back to Maryville tomorrow." "When I come back, you can take as long a look as you wish." And his eyes changed, and he laid a hand on Collins' shoulder. "Take it from me. You've given me your word that the boys won't do Pete dirt. Remember, he never plugged any of you. He's got his hands tied now, Collins, and if any of the boys try fancy stunts with him, maybe I'll be making a quick trip back from Tuxie. Savvy?" His eyes held Collins for the briefest moment, and then he swung into his saddle and rode east with the farewell yells of the posse ringing after him. By the time they were in their saddles, Geraldine had topped a hill several yards ahead, and his figure was black against the moon. The wind from the east blew back his song to them faintly. "I don't expect no bloomin' tears, and the only thing I ask is something for a monument in the way of a whiskey flies." Collins turned in his saddle. "Look at him, boys. If it wasn't for what happened tonight, I'd lay 10-1 that was the ghost on the wing for his hiding place." The consuming fire. Since the days of Bluebeard, the best way to make a man do a thing is to tell him to avoid it. The most jaded appetite tastes the forbidden with relish. The boy climbs the fence not because he wants to get to the other side, but because the fence is there, telling him to keep out. And the heart of the debutante yearns towards the dangerous man whom her mother has ruled out. Consequently, though the world lay at the feet of young Ed Raleigh, and he could have traveled to Paris or Peking with a full pocketbook and the consent of his father, the one region in which his heart turned was the forbidden Bald Eagle Mountains. It was his father who forbade it. "In them mountains," he was wont to say, "there's just enough gold to break a man's heart and turn him into a waster." Yet Pete Raleigh had made his stake and found his wife in those same mountains, and the very ground he cursed was the scene of tales he loved to spin. The Raleigh ranch had spread through the length and breadth of the valley, and while this might be called the common-sense kingdom of Pete Raleigh, the kingdom of his fancy to which his memory inevitably turned was the Bald Eagle Mountains, the burned brown peaks along the valley and the faraway crests of the upper range, blue with distance and tipped with snow. To young Ed Raleigh, that land was a fairy realm, peopled with the men and women of his father's stories. And what the ancestral sword, rust-eaten and battle-hewn shields were to the young squire of the Dark Ages, the old mucking spoon and drill set of Pete Raleigh were to his son. until finally, having one day ridden a pitching outlaw in a fashion to have swelled the heart of the most hardy bronc peeler with pride, Ed Raleigh awoke to the knowledge that he was a man. He reasoned, not without justification, that if he could stick to a wild horse without a bucking roll, he could fight his way and follow his nose through the world. When he arrived at this decision, the first place his eyes turned was towards the left-hand cut. That deep defile like a knife cut through the Bald Eagle Range, where the railroad slid over the heights and down into the valley. For the left-hand cut was the gate of fairyland. And in the center of the cut stood the town of Sierra Padre, in whose streets the men of his father's yarns had fought and drunk and gambled and died. Ed Raleigh was too wise to tell his father where he was going. He merely kissed the white head of his mother, whispered in her ear, and then fled from her tears. An hour later, he was plodding down the valley behind a pack burro and seeing the world through the long, flapping ears in the most approved prospector fashion. And in his hand, he carried his hammer and started chipping rocks within 5 miles of the ranch house. To be sure, he knew nothing or next to nothing about ore, but 6'2" of arrow-straight manhood, 25 carefree years on the range, and nearly 200 pounds of stringy muscles, hard as sinews, are an equipment complete in themselves. Ed Raleigh did not know the color of hematite from the color of wild violets, but he intended to learn. He was eager enough to dig for the center of the earth and about strong enough to get there.
This story is continued on the other side of the cassette.